Hi folks, Darren O'Caffer here from the Community Sector Council. Thanks for joining us on Friday afternoon for the fifth in our series of capacity sustaining webinars. Really lucky to have Ron Pizzo with us today, who's going to give us a walkthrough around the Prosocial Matrix. A couple of points of order before I go further and introduce Ron. We're going to go till about 12:45 today. We'll do a check-in at that point. If there's more conversation, more dialogue, we'll push right through to 1, but we're gonna have a hard stop at 1. If anybody has to leave, don't worry at all about it. Feel free to leave quietly. We'll have recordings available of the session in a couple of days, so you'll get an email with a recording of the session if you have to leave, so no worries there. In terms of format, you can post questions in the question box. There should be a question box in your tool panel there. At the end of Ron's presentation, we'll collate all the questions and then we'll do a bit of a Q&A so Ron can have a bit of a chance to expand upon any kind of queries you have. This is an virtual session and we're here virtually, but we are embodied creatures and we do walk across this land. And as such, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between two nations. We're really lucky today to have Ron Pizzo with us. Ron's webinar will give us a chance to explore a little bit about what your organization will look like when life returns to normal after the COVID-19 disruption, or at least what you can start to plan around strategically what you'd like to do in terms of building some capacity back. How are you coping with the current crisis? What lessons have you learned so far? And where do you want to go from here? These are some of the questions that Ron would like to explore, and he's going to use the Prosocial Matrix Communication Process to help unpack this stuff. Ron is a certified facilitator, mediator, and coach. He's a partner in the law firm Pink Larkin and has practiced labor and employment law for many years. He's recognized as being among the best lawyers in Canada in the field of labor law. He's a certified coactive coach holding the CPCC designation and is certified in conversational intelligence coaching. He is trained as a prosocial facilitator and has been certified in the Prosocial Matrix Communication Process. Prosocial is concerned with the science of working together better and an evidence-based approach for building productivity and improving collaboration among teams and groups. And as such, it's such a perfect fit for these sessions. When we talk as a team at the Community Sector Council, we really wanted to try and provide something different or an extra piece to the dialogue that's currently out there in terms of capacity building, capacity management. And what we thought was a good idea was to have a look at some sessions that were around capacity sustaining. How do we manage to kind of move through this, move our missions along, and be ready for when this thing blows over? So Ron is a perfect person to round out the week of webinars. Really, really delighted to have Ron with us this afternoon. So really looking forward to the presentation. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to tap them into the question box and we'll get them to the end. And Ron, feel free to go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you, Darren. That was quite the introduction. So hope I can deliver on half the stuff. So let me open, I thought my presentation was open. Let me see if I can open it here. There we go. Yeah, so I asked this question here, the COVID-19, what's the future of organizations? And in talking to various people, leaders who are dealing with this issue, everyone's been really busy planning, trying to figure out what the future will hold. The truth is, we may know and we may not know. So really, what's most important for your organization? What do you really need to have? What skills do your teams need? And I think the things that are going to be the most important for your teams are really, being adaptable and being flexible, because things, although you may have certain plans, you may have certain ideas of what's going to happen, things will change. So, and this is what the ACT matrix is really good to deal with. It's good to deal with change and creating flexible teams. So, this is what the ACT matrix looks like. It's this matrix of 4 quadrants. We have outside noticing, inside noticing, away, and toward. So, outside noticing is a noticing we can do with our 5 senses. It's what we see, It's what we hear. It's what we can touch or feel, what we can taste, and what we can smell. And right now, you're observing me with your 5 senses in the sense that you're hearing my voice and you're seeing my presentation. Now, everything below the horizontal line is insight or mental noticing. It's what goes on in your brain. So as you hear my words and see my presentation, you start having certain thoughts. And based on those thoughts, you're going to do certain actions. And you could either decide that this isn't worth it and you just go away, or you could decide, well, I'm going to listen some more. And I'm hoping that you're going to pick listening some more. And the big part of this matrix is in the center here, and it's about me noticing. And what we're doing with this matrix is we're slowing the process down. We're going to observe what we notice with our outside senses, what we notice inside, and then what we do and how we react. And this noticing is really above the matrix. It's almost as if you were at Skylab looking down on yourself, seeing what you do, how you react, what shows up inside. And it's almost like looking down at the world from Skylab. And it's really about slowing the process down, becoming very mindful of what it is that you do and whether what you do is workable. So what we're trying to train with the matrix, and what I showed you before was the me matrix, the individual matrix. And that's how I start all my sessions with this process with the individual matrix, is psychological flexibility. Psychological flexibility is the ability to adapt to a situation with awareness, openness, and focus, and to take effective action guided by your values. And the latest research promotes supporting psychological flexibility as a cornerstone of well-being and also very important for resilience. So when, for instance, people are in conflict, they're not talking to each other, that's a very stuck position. And they see each other, they don't get along, they don't talk, that's inflexible responding. It takes someone to say or to think that they're going to do something different to start a dialogue or to approach the other person, a more flexible approach if they're going to resolve their conflict. So this ACT matrix, and I should have said this from the beginning, it's ACT is based on behavioral science. So this is all evidence-based, and it's been used quite a bit in workplaces. So we're going to work through this ACT matrix to show you how we create flexibility. So the first question we ask in the bottom right quadrant is, who is important to you? And I do this every time I start a session. I ask who's important to you, because it really, people can relate to that. And they say typically things like parents, family, their partners, children, colleagues. Sometimes it could be pets, could be your neighbor. So it's the whole host of people that are important to you. Then we ask at the bottom left corner quadrant, what shows up inside and gets in the way? And typical feelings that get in the way are anger, resentment, fear, anxiety, imagining the worst. So for instance, you can get angry at a partner, you can get angry at your children. That shows up and gets in the way of moving toward them. You can have fear, fear, for instance, if your children go to school, are they going to get hurt? I'm sure there's a lot of fear and anxiety around COVID-19. What would happen when they return to work? Imagining the worst, sometimes that shows up quite a bit. Oftentimes when we want something to go well, we start thinking about things like, what if this goes wrong? What could happen? And that can be paralyzing too. The typical example is when people are asked to public speak, right? Or speak in public. They always imagine the worst, so what could happen? And also there's a self-judgment, am I good enough? Am I this enough? All those things can show up inside. And so then we ask, what do you do to move away from the unwanted inside stuff? Avoidance things are things that typically happen. like sitting on the sofa, or sometimes doing something like exercising can be an avoidance where you're trying to avoid those feelings or move away from them or avoid the problem. You just go out and exercise. Drinking could be an activity, walking away. So there are many things we do to move away from the unwanted inner stuff. Then we ask this question, is it workable? And workability really is in terms of, does it move you toward who is important to you? For instance, drinking in the short term can be workable in that whatever unwanted inner feelings you have, you forget about them. But in the long term, if that's the only way you respond to something, it's not workable. Drinking can actually make things worse. It just takes you back to the bottom left. Exercising, sometimes it's an away move, sometimes it's a toward move. It all depends on how you use it. So exercising may be great in the short term because it's good for your health, but if it's really because you're trying to avoid a problem, it's not very workable. And so we start looking at what we do from the perspective of workability. And then once we notice whether something's workable or not, this is the other question. What could you do to move toward who's important to you? And if it's a disagreement with a spouse or a partner, you could go talk about it, go out on a date night, or if it's just that you haven't spent any time with your friends, go out with your friends, acknowledge a colleague. When you have that ego feeling that you just, you're upset and angry because maybe it should have been you instead of your colleague. Well, one toward move would be, again, to say, despite all that inner feeling, is to acknowledge your colleague, for example. Now, not all, because of the workability test, you have to understand that not all away moves are bad. So, for instance, you can think of a situation where a bear is chasing you. And if you're being chased, what shows up inside? It could be fear. And what do? You run away. Well, in that circumstance, running away is probably the right thing to do. So workability is really important because it kind of shifts the dynamic. It's no longer right or wrong, it's what's workable. We ask the question, who's important to you, because it's a metaphor for values. The lower right-hand quadrant is all about values. We can change the question to what is important to you, or even what are your values? And the idea of ACT is to get people taking actions that are consistent with their values. And here's the big thing. There's a distinction between values and goals. We sometimes are goal-oriented. Goals are a destination, and there are lots of reasons why you can't achieve a goal that are beyond your control. So with the ACT matrix, what we're doing is actually redefining success, moving away from whether you judge you're successful about whether, from the perspective of whether you attained a goal, to defining success in terms of whether you acted in accordance with your values. So you can think of a situation where, let's say, a family decides to go to a park, and there are two children, and one child's really focused on arriving and going to the park, while the other child has a value of adventure. And so as you're driving to the park, your car breaks down, which sets off a whole bunch of adventures between getting towed, trying to find out what to do, who to talk to, the people you encounter, all sorts of things happen, but you never actually make it to the park. Well, the child whose goal was to arrive to the park would be really disappointed because he didn't get to his goal. Whereas a child who really likes adventure may have had a great day because, man, they did all sorts of different things they didn't expect to do. So that's the importance of valued living. the other thing about the ACT matrix is that feelings just are. They're not good, they're not bad, they are what they are. And it's all in how you respond to your feelings. Feelings are kind of normal, like this fear, anger, anxiety, all those things are going to show up. And they're all parts of normal life. And what we try to do with ACT is to normalize that. The issue is, how are you going to act? Are you going to do a toward move or an away move? Are you going to do something that's workable? And that's the whole thing about feelings. So it's not, you know, you can't turn off a feeling. Lots of people come to me and they say, in fact, I've just finished coaching someone or working with someone who said, I don't want to feel frustrated. I'm just feeling frustrated and I don't want that feeling. The reality is, to turn off that feeling to frustration means that you're also turning off all your feelings. You just can't not turn one thing off. You can't have fear without joy. You can't have, it doesn't work that way. You're either a feeling being or you're not. The other thing is, sometimes these inner feelings have important messages. Sometimes you're feared or afraid of speaking in public because there's a real value there. There's an importance to you wanting to speak in public. And sometimes it's just noticing that helps kind of deal with the fear and the anxiety. So we're not worried about trying to change people or change who they are. What the ACT matrix does is try to change how you act. So the focus in ACT is on workability and choice. And Viktor Frankl wrote this: between stimulus and response, there is a space, and that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our freedom and our growth. So Frankl was a psychiatrist. He was Jewish. He was interned during the Second World War. I think he was in Auschwitz. And when he was there, he noticed that some people who were in these concentration camps were not resilient at all. They just virtually, from the moment they entered, they just shriveled up and died, while other people seemed to be more resilient to the circumstance. They seemed to be able to survive. And he asked himself, and he wondered, what was the difference? What he noticed was that the people who were able to thrive or survive better in those terrible circumstances chose to, for example, notice that the sun was shining, or they chose to notice that the birds were singing. Some people, although everyone didn't have a lot of food, chose to hold back some of their rations to provide relief to other people. And what he noticed is that in those very terrible circumstances, the last freedom that an individual had was their freedom to choose their response. And that choice made them more resilient. And when we work with the matrix, the noticing, the slowing down the process, the choosing how to react to an inner feeling, whether it's away or toward, is this choice. Now, obviously, in the concentration camps, there weren't a lot of choices about different actions that an individual could take, but there were still some. There were still some freedoms, and those are freedoms that no one could take away, and that was a source of strength. So now we're going to talk about the prosocial matrix, the team matrix. We're going to talk about how all these lessons apply to the team matrix. In the first matrix, we train psychological flexibility, this ability to choose your response. In the prosocial matrix, we're going to train psychological safety. Now, Google did a multi-year study, and they wanted to look at their teams to figure out why some teams stumbled while others soared. So the company organized a group of its best statisticians, organizational psychologists, sociologists, and engineers, and they looked at teams that were effective and teams that were struggling over 2 years, and they tried to find out what it is that made a team succeed while another failed. And here are the 5 factors that Google came up with: psychological safety, dependability, structure, clarity, meaning, and impact. But the most important was psychological safety. And psychological safety was a condition that allows for people to speak up, for people to take risks and speak their mind, to be creative, to stick their necks out without fear of having them cut off. They're prepared to be vulnerable in front of each other. That was the difference. Not so much whether everyone got along, because there were a lot of teams where people didn't necessarily get along. There was a book by Duhigg, isn't it, Smarter, Better, Faster, and he talked about psychological flexibility and looked at the Saturday Night Live crew when that show first started, with all those very famous comedians. What he noticed is that they didn't necessarily all get along on a personal level, but when they got together as a group, they were all committed to what was important to show, and they were all willing to give each other the space to talk, to make comments, to give input, and to make the show better. So psychological safety made that possible. So when we work with the matrix, hold on a second here. There we go. This is what the prosocial matrix looks like. And it's the same as the me matrix, but the questions are different and they're asked in a safe way. So the bottom right corner, which deals with values, we talk about what is our shared purpose. We talk about, on the away side, what unwanted stuff shows up inside group members that gets in the way of moving toward the shared purpose. In the upper left corner, we talk about what members might do to move away from the unwanted stuff, and what could we do to move toward shared purposes. The questions are asked in such a way that it doesn't require anyone to point out any other team member. It also indirectly deals with the problem. So people aren't really talking about the problem directly at first. So they're not talking about how they're stuck with each other. They're talking about what sorts of things might show up inside team members. In fact, sometimes we can change the question and you can ask it this way: what unwanted stuff could show up in any team that might get in the way of moving toward shared purpose? I recall once working with a team that was really, really stuck, and they had gone through a lot of coaching. They had a lot of reports, a lot of assessments, but it didn't work very well. So I was asked if I could do anything, but again, the real issue is that you can't really go in and coach them. They've been overcoached. So what approach was I going to use to deal with this very stuck team? Well, what I did to create psychological safety is I decided to have a session for them, which I called Verbal Tai Chi in the Workplace, how to deal with difficult people. And we started talking about dealing with difficult people because this particular team had to deal with a lot of difficult customers, a lot of difficult people who came to use our services. That indirect approach, when we started talking about difficult people, they started to understand that really when they were dealing with difficult people, they were also they themselves difficult, and they themselves we were talking about their issues, although it was in the context of another circumstance. Because of that, so when that's the beauty of this matrix, we can do these things and not talk directly about the problem. So people can start having conversations. And I remember another team where everyone was very, very stuck. And, you know, we started talking about feelings that showed up. And another thing about this matrix to create psychological safety is that we take the stance that there are no wrong answers. Whenever someone says something, we put it on the matrix someplace. We pick a quadrant. We let the person pick the quadrant. And that's important too, because that increases the sense of safety in that there are no wrong answers. So the real magic, though, in this matrix is with shared purpose. Now, the person who came up with the matrix, his name is Dr. Kevin Polk. And when Dr. Polk came up with the matrix, he was actually asked to go in the United States, where he is, and asked to go work with a group of people, half of which were pro-gun control, and the other half of which were, of course, advocates of what is the Second Amendment, I think, the right to bear arms. And as you can imagine, when you walk into that environment, people have very stuck perspectives. So the challenge he was given was, how was he going to get these people to have a conversation around gun control when their views are very polarized? So his approach was to focus on shared purpose. Shared purpose. So he said, what is our shared purpose? And that's where they spent most of the first session. And after they discussed that issue, they came to the realization that what was important to both groups was safety. One group, the right to bear arms group, thought that having guns was a source of safety. The other group thought that not having guns, limiting or restricting firearms, made things safer. Once they understood that they shared that common purpose, then they were able to talk about workability. And workability, when we looked at it first in the me matrix, whether something's workable in the short term or workable in the long term, the workability question was, what objective evidence or what factors are we going to agree to determine whether an action is workable or not? So over the 2 days, these very polarized people who typically just shout at each other were able to have conversations about what their shared purpose and what was workable and how to determine whether something was workable or not. And that changed everything. Now, sometimes when I do this workability thing, I also like to use these 5 questions. What do we do? Who do we do it for? How do they benefit? And what is important about that? So take the case of, for instance, a person who picks up your garbage. They may think their job is completely unimportant. But if you run through these 4 questions, what do you notice? So we ask, what do you do? Well, we collect garbage. Who do you do it for? The public. How do they benefit? Well, the garbage is taken away. It smells. It's terrible. And what is important about that to the people you do it for? Well, it's important for health and safety. And when you answer these 5 questions, you can create this one sentence about our shared purpose. We collect garbage for the public so they can live in healthy, clean, and sanitary conditions. Suddenly, there's a very clear idea of why we do what we do. Again, the importance of that is that this can give you a rallying point. Suddenly, They're just not trash collectors. They're people who perform an important public function, and they can understand what matters and what is important. Once people understand their shared purpose and understand that what an organization has to do is achieve its shared purpose, they can be flexible as to how it's done. Whether an objective has to change, an organizational objective, whether an action, a goal has to change, is understandable if it's change in service of a shared purpose. It's easier to change. It's easier to have that dialogue and conversation. Whereas if you start measuring success in terms of goals and objectives, then it gets very hard and more difficult when something isn't working. So with this idea or notion of shared purpose, we can start asking these sorts of questions about toward moves. How do we have to be as a team to achieve our shared purpose? So we can start having conversations about how we have to be as a team. We can start asking, what do we have to do to achieve our organizational goals and objectives? And how do we have to be to deal with goals and objectives that may have to change? We can start having critical conversations or important conversations around the being part and the doing part, the toward moves, and not just about what we have to do to achieve a goal, but also how do we have to be if we need to change. So with the matrix, what we're doing, we're training two things. We're training psychological flexibility, and we're training psychological safety. We're creating an environment where teams can get together in a safe space to have conversations about what matters. We're creating a safe space where teams can talk about their shared purpose and really what their objectives are. And then once we know that, we can start talking about what we have to do to achieve those, and also what we have to do in the case those objectives have to change. So what we do with the matrix, and what I see each time when I use this very straightforward tool, is I create a situation where people start to understand the importance of what they do and how they have to be to achieve those goals. And they also understand how things have to change. Teams become adaptable, they become flexible. And this adaptability and flexibility is exactly what your organization is going to need in this post-COVID world. So that kind of brings me to the questions part. If you have any questions, I'm trying to respect your time, and I'm sure you may have lots of questions, maybe, because there are lots of things we do when we do this work with teams.
Thanks, Ron. That was absolutely fantastic. A fascinating look at a really evidence-based tool that can help us kind of make some sense of how to pull our teams together and move with some kind of degree of purpose towards a more kind of operational, focused way to come out of this thing with some sense that we're on track. We have a couple of questions. We have a couple of minutes here. A couple of quick questions. Ron, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how these approaches are actioned in an organization in regard to power. What is there differences in terms of how you would roll this out with a leadership team versus a staff team? And in particular, I'm curious about how this impacts people's abilities to be vulnerable, because one of the things I picked up from your talk is that it's really crucial to begin this process with this kind of psychological, building this kind of space where people are safe to open up and to really talk about, excuse me, what's holding them back from actualizing themselves professionally and personally in the job. So I wonder if you could speak briefly just about how the role or how the artifact of power kind of plays into this process here, and does it really play in at all, or can you apply this approach broadly across teams without really worrying too much about positions and leadership versus line staff and that kind of thing?
Well, that's a good question, and that's something I deal with every time. And sometimes you have to train the leaders, because typically, if we go back, I guess we can go back a few, if we go back, let's see if we can go back a few slides here at the beginning. In slideshow, enter. Right. So I go back to the individual matrix, this one. And oftentimes, what you notice in leaders is that they feel they're very committed towards organizational goals. So like their toward move, or what they're motivated by, is outcomes. And when they're motivated by outcomes, there's a fear that arises, anger or an anxiety about not making the outcomes. And so what they start to do is they start to really micromanage and use the control agenda, which is what the away moves are all about. And in fact, not only does it, it has an impact on the people who the leader is leading, right? So if a leader comes, in the sense that if someone starts using the control agenda, it certainly creates in the people who they are controlling issues, safety issues, issues about lack of autonomy. So I tell leaders, when you come in the room, you kind of have to, and if you're going to be part of the process, kind of have to leave your authority outside the door. And then I also ask them, when I do this process, actually I do it with them, I introduce it, I'm actually doing a coaching with the leaders themselves, and they don't realize they're going through a coaching, they're just seeing me present this. So I ask them questions, for instance, like, what is your authority? How do you exercise your authority? How do you know if someone is, what do you need to do? Do you need to control everything they do? Or is it enough to go in and look at what the results are, or what the outcomes are? Are we moving towards our shared purposes? So we start redefining what control is. We start redefining authority. We start redefining, sometimes I'll redefine also, whose problem is it? Like, who has to solve the problem? You can think of a team, for example. What does the coach do? If you're the leader, are you the coach? And who plays in the field? It's the team. And how do you know whether they're achieving results? So we start talking about the power dynamics. We start talking about authority. And I ask them to leave their power outside. And also, I ask them that when you go into this room, and we get actually explicit agreements, that nothing that happens in this room can be used to discipline anyone, and that everyone has to come in equally. And I also ask them just to listen, right? To hear people out and don't get upset. Notice their own matrix as people are talking. Notice what's showing up inside of you, noticing how you're reacting, and be aware of what you're going to do next. Because if you do an away move, you can just kill the process. So I deal with those issues, and the extent to which I have to deal with, it's really turns on how problematic the leadership style may be in these particular circumstances.
So really the focus remains this kind of idea that, to some extent, you kind of go back up to 10,000 feet as a leader and you try to focus on the objectives rather than the minutia of micromanagement. But at the same time, it really does fall down to this perspective of creating a safe space so that the team can be fully fleshed out and kind of, actualize in the most kind of self-aggrandizing or satisfying way. So the job of the leaders in this position is to really leave the ego at the door and come in and see the objectives of the organization as the tantamount and kind of pinnacle of what you're trying to get out of the process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to notice that just because you do that doesn't mean you're giving up authority and control, and doesn't mean you're giving up your leadership role. It's just you're going to do it differently in a way that's going to achieve shared purposes and make everyone work together better.
Right, that's a fantastic observation, actually. In fact, like by doing that, you're moving closer to the thing that's kind of causing frustration for a lot of leaders, which is, maybe, the worry that you're not going to hit a target or an objective. And it's almost counterintuitive to some extent. Like you really have to rescind some of that tight control and really empower your team to get them to produce better and more quality work and work more efficiently. It really seems like a really fantastic way to approach this kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting. I read a quote by General Patton, and you think of Patton in World War II as being the most controlling guy. And, his quote was something to the effect, tell people what you want them to accomplish and get out of the way, and you'll be surprised at what they do.
I love that. I think it reminds me of the founder of 37 Signals at a fairly famous .com, and when he was asked what is the thing you have to manage the most, he said it's the M&Ms, the meetings and the managers. He said, really, I have to make sure that they're working well so that they get out of the way of the staff. So we don't have an overburden of meetings, and we make sure that the managers are empowered correctly and appropriately so that the staff can actually get on with the work. Fantastic.
Right, and the interesting thing is that this also sets up a different way of doing check-ins, right? Of doing reviews, checking in to see whether people are achieving what they should be achieving. It creates a dialogue, a better way to do that, those evaluations. And you're evaluating different things, right? So it makes it easier to do that. It makes it easier to say, look, I'm gonna let you do the stuff, but we're all committed to our shared purpose. These are the objectives we want to reach. And we have to make sure that we're on track. And when I meet with you to talk to you, it's all about, are we going on track? So everyone's committed to a purpose rather than being afraid of being judged for what they do, whether they're good or bad, right?
Right. Yeah, makes tons of sense. Yeah. Maybe an extension of that, one of the takeaways from having spent 2.5 decades in the nonprofit sector is that we're often reacting to things. And I think one of your slides there mentioned this, this separation between response and reaction. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons. The amazing turnover of HR assets, the people we need to work in nonprofits. The funding changes it seems sometimes almost weekly. When governments change, a lot of our nonprofits and charitable organizations, are spun. And I wonder if you could speak just a little bit about how we can build better mechanisms within teams. And I think you kind of hinted at a lot of this and really dug into some of it around this kind of return to shared purpose and shared focus. But could you maybe just expand a little more on how to build that sense of reaction the sense of response versus reaction within a team?
Right. So it really is about digging into the shared purpose. And, I'm kind of reminded by something that just happened. I'm Halifax. The mayor just got on, or someone from the management got on TV and said, we are not hiring back our casual staff. Boom. And it was just this news announcement. And how cold that is, right? And it's because people aren't talking to the people involved. And so in a lot of organizations, when management, I've noticed, brings in changes or have to deal with very difficult things, the thing they want to do the most is to avoid this unwanted inner stuff, because they don't want to talk to people. They don't want to bring bad news. And that results in all these, what I call clinical statements. We have to reduce, we have to get rid. And that's what causes actually conflict. Now, if people were actually willing to talk and understood their shared purpose and meet with people and say, we're having a difficult time, and this is where we have to go, and these are the things we have to do, and these are some changes we have to make, and to sit there and to talk to their people, then it changes the whole dynamic. The dynamic changes, the people themselves change, they start to understand. And then you can have a dialogue about how are we going to do this best in this very difficult situation. So really what this matrix does is it kind of puts everyone on a level where they can talk to each other despite these difficult inner feelings that may show up. And if you can talk to each other, then you can start to create understanding. You can start to, some decisions are going to be difficult. You can even start thinking about different ways you may want to deal with a difficult situation. For instance, there are some organizations have talked about, sharing work. And I'm not saying that's appropriate in this circumstance or any circumstance, but they can start having discussions about what it is that they can do. There may be suggestions from the people who work about how we're going to do it best, or how we're going to adapt to this change, and how we're going to change the way we work. So that's what this matrix is supposed to do. It's supposed to create a setting where people can have input, and they can, just even to be heard. So when they talk about psychological safety, the study showed that it wasn't so much about whether someone had a chance to talk and to influence a change. What really mattered was whether someone could be heard. And that made all the difference.
It's fascinating. It comes back to being generally not just better professionals, but also just better people, trying to be kinder, more compassionate to each other, to listen, and to make sure that that space is kept for everybody, for the team, with this idea that we're all marching towards that same purpose again. I mean, we speak about this a lot in strategic planning. A lot of the effort we put into strategic planning is trying to find these kind of foundational pieces so that everybody on the team, from management down to line staff, all understand that we're all rowing in the same direction. And I think that's what you're getting at is helping to clarify some of those roles, helping to clarify some of those internal structures in the team can often be the thing that shifts the focus from this kind of ragged reaction to more purposeful response. So just taking 5 minutes sometimes to talk through something, to feel heard, can allow someone to go back to their desk and feel like they're able to get along with the work that actually makes sense, as opposed to feeling like they're spinning their wheels.
Yeah.
I know we're sorry, please go ahead.
I just want to tell you one, like Covey, like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? This is what he talks about, like starting with the end in mind and putting first things first are the first steps. Understanding the organizational mission statement is the most important thing, and being able to participate in creating it. Individuals being able to participate instead of it being dictated from on high is very important. And that makes the difference between organizations that are effective and those that, well, don't do so well.
Right. Could you just remind us where that came from, just for folks who are listening, just so they can
right. So if you just look at Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that old text, and I'm looking at it's in that book, and he talks about starting with the end in mind as part of one of the effective habits, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think even within our work at the Community Sector Council, when we talk about effective strategic planning, the first step is understanding where you are, the situational awareness piece. The second step is understanding where you're going to get to. With those two bookends in place, filling in the middle ground becomes more mechanical than it does, this kind of deep, kind of probing process. And I think that thing that once you understand what the horizon is that everybody's looking at, and what tools we have and resources and assets we have to begin with, all of a sudden getting there then becomes a question of how do we share the burden, how do we allocate correct resources, and it becomes less of this kind of pivot every weekend thing that often I see in the nonprofit world. And you get to work on Monday, and by the time Friday rolls around, the whole landscape is shifted around. And that can lead to really frustrating work, I just want to note that we're just running over a little bit. I have one more question, if you don't mind, Ron. I know we're kind of 5 minutes over here, but if you're okay with it,
sure.
I'll just go with one more question. Yeah, okay. One of the other observations, I think, from spending time in the nonprofit sector is that we're very values driven. We work to produce residual value for our communities. We don't create residual capital for shareholders. And most of the people that work in the nonprofit sector are deeply driven by this concept that we're trying to lift the burden of people in our communities, trying to make sure that everybody has a fair shake, everybody has a seat at the table. And this is absolutely crucial. Now, one of the problems often with this, when you lead with this, is that it can be very difficult to balance the mechanical stuff. As a fond participant in one of the sessions said to me one time, I do this work out of love. The problem is it's very hard to get full on a love sandwich. And so, you have to end up working in the nonprofit sector, balancing out the operational stuff with the values-driven piece. And I think, again, you've kind of hinted around this stuff really about, defining where we're going, how to share. But I wonder if you've any closing reflections on how to try and hold those two things precious, because that's been a part of this series, this concept that going through the COVID crisis, as nonprofit workers, it's quite difficult sometimes for us to divide up this need to attend to our families, to our loved ones, to our communities, to the world more generally, because we give away so much of that passion and love to our work during the day. And so I just wonder if you could comment a little bit about how we can use tools like the Prosocial Matrix or some of these kind of frameworks to help better build teams that are values-based, but at the same time can focus on the operational stuff. And again, I think you've already kind of hinted at this, right, but if you've any closing remarks, it would be lovely to hear.
So when I work and I do this prosocial work, this is the introductory start, okay? Then I also get the me matrix, the who's important. We have the we matrix, which is prosocial. But then I go back to the me matrix and where I fit in that prosocial thing. Because, for instance, I would do a matrix around collaboration and put collaboration in the middle, and you can look at the positives and the negatives. And so I'm also, it's kind of mixing the two. So the we has to mix with the me, and the me has to have some self-care. And in fact, in shared purpose, it's not just what we want to do, but we can also have as a shared purpose, self-care. We can also understand and build understanding about why we may need time away for ourselves. And we use other techniques like the bullseye technique, where we talk about, if you're giving 100% to work, where's the rest of your life? Where's the balance? And if we build into our shared purpose this need for balance, this need for team self-care, then we can start talking about that as an appropriate value as well. That's very important because, again, Kobe talked about this. If you talked about the productive capacity, which is the individual, and what you produce. If you kill the individual, they don't produce anything. So it's all taking care of yourself is all part of achieving a shared purpose.
I just love that statement. I think that's just a fantastic way to kind of close the series, is this idea that self-care and caring of each other as team members should be a central preoccupation with our work. And just this concept of sitting down and banging away at the work isn't enough. We have to see, we have to see the work as part of who we are as people, and we have to take care of each other within our teams, within our organizations. And I'll just say, for my own sake, across the sector too, we should look out for each other. We have to dispense with this competitive nature that has infused the sector. It is so much about trying to build better communities for ourselves, for our families, and for the people who are out there on the margins who get missed all the time. Ron, I just want to thank you. That was a fantastic talk. I really, really enjoyed it. I love the balance of pragmatism and compassion that you bring to this work. It's wonderful to see in the sector. I'm really hoping we have a chance to get you back down the road for some more work. Before we close out today, I just want to let you guys know that we will have a download of the session. There are a couple of questions here about whether we'll have a recording. We will indeed. I really want to thank the speakers this week. It's been an absolutely amazing week of webinars. We had Nick Momberket, David Euler, Tanya Siliakis, Jeff Ward, and today Ron Pizzo. I think we did a really, really good cross-section of how to try and bring these things, these compassion pieces, these value pieces, and these practical and pragmatic pieces together. It's work that we'll continue to do at the Community Sector Council alongside collaborators and partners like Ron. Again, thank you so much to everybody that tuned in during the week. Keep an eye on your virtual news feeds and whatnot. Certainly will be sitting down as a team, debriefing these, looking at what we can do to try and get them better. And then we'll be coming back to the sector with some more of this virtual learning as we all continue to try and make some sense of these things. I wish you all a really good weekend. Stay safe, stay sane in these bizarre times, and keep an eye to the horizon. We'll be back with more of this stuff down the road. Thanks very much and have a great weekend.